Boa tarde, bem-vindos a mais uma tarde aqui no ciclo de conferências deste ano da Escola de Artes da Católica. Desta vez vou fazer a apresentação do professor Fred Moten em inglês, para ele me entender, mas de qualquer modo queria apenas dizer que em português ainda, que é para mim uma honra enorme e um privilégio, acho que é para todos, termos connosco hoje o professor Fred Moten, que é um professor de Performance Studies da Universidade de Nova Iorque. Eu vou então apresentá-lo em inglês. It is my great honor to welcome Professor Fred Moten to this year's cycle of conferences and performances here at Escola das Artes. Fred Moten is a cultural theorist and poet. Professor Moten studies the social practice of poetry, criticism, creating new spaces for emergent forms of Black cultural aesthetics and social life. He works with lots of social and aesthetic study groups, including Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, the Black Arts Movement School Modality, Le Mardi Gras Listening Collective, the Center for Convivial Research and Autonomy, Moved by the Motion, the Institute of Physical Sociality, and the Harris Moten Quartet. He is the author of the seminal 3-volume treatise, Consent Not to Be a Single Being, which includes essays written over the course of 15 years on topics as diverse as Billie Holiday, Theodor Adorno, and Immanuel Kant. His most recent work, in collaboration with Brandon Lopez and Gerald Clever, is The Blacksmiths, The Flowers. He lives in New York and is a professor of performance studies at New York University. Please welcome Professor Fred Moten.
Thank you very much, Djaimilia. I want to thank Daniel, Maria, all of the people who are responsible for me being able to be here with you today. And along with my thanks to you for being here, I also have to apologize that I have to speak in English. I tried to take Portuguese in college, but it didn't end well. There was anyway. But I, I'm happy to be with you here physically, and also I hope, even though I'm in a different language, I'm here with you in spirit as well. What I want to do today is to focus on a word which is not really a word, even in the language that I speak. I realize that in many ways, this word, which is not a word, and it's probably not quite a concept either, definitely allows me to place my work, not just over the past 10 years or so, but really for 40 years, to place it within a specific context and genealogy, which I'm happy to do, even though I'm probably a kind of deviant within that strain as well, of necessity. I was talking with Djaimilia a little bit just now, and I was remarking on the fact that as I get older, there are two issues that I find myself increasingly dealing with. One is that the old sort of fashioned, I guess, normative way of delivering lectures, it seems no longer available to me. It just feels very strange, at least within the American academic context. What that usually means is reading an essay out loud to an audience when that audience could just as easily have read the essay for themselves. And often it's a strange, it creates a kind of strange effect in which I find myself reading something aloud which was never meant to be read aloud. And I always end up feeling that in the middle of reading that no one could possibly understand anything that I'm saying, because everything becomes increasingly hermetic. Everything becomes much less about trying to finish an argument as it is trying to open up spaces or to blaze some sort of trail or path towards a new argument. And maybe even sometimes an argument against the normative conception of argumentation itself. Which is to say that in this regard, it feels like when I'm reading something aloud, I'm reading something that is trying its best to deviate towards poetry. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that it shouldn't be sounded out. It just really ends up meaning that it shouldn't be read aloud by me. It's a strange thing. But I've learned my lesson, and I'm not even going to try to do that today. Okay. The other thing that I've noticed in the past few years is that I have to come to grips with the fact that my aging body is not meant to be very far away from where it lives most of the time, right? That it's not just about jet lag. It's not just about moving across time zones. It makes me really think that there is a kind of irreducible locality at the level of our physical existence. That there is something about being grounded in a place and of not moving very far away from that place, which might actually be bound up with our, again, our biological specificity. And there's something about this which is oppressive. I'm so happy to be in new places. I'm happy to travel and to visit and to go far away, even though it doesn't necessarily it makes you feel good, but it doesn't make you feel good, if I can say that. And so what I'm interested in is a kind of conflict between, between what appears to be this sort of physical locality that we are embedded in, and what appears also to be this radical desire for non-locality that we all share, right? So that theme appears to me to be very cognate with the general theme of these encounters that you've been having over the past year, the problem of the stranger and of estrangement. So it's one way to enter into that problem, and it connects up with the way that I had wanted to begin, that I intimated just a few seconds ago, regarding a particular word that I've been sort of led to. I don't know if the right word is, have I been led to this word, or has the word been drawn from me in some way? It's an interesting question. Maybe we'll figure out an answer to it in the next few minutes. The word is displacement, but it's not the normal way in which that term is given, and certainly not the normal way in which it's spelled and in which it's typographically arranged in English. So I have to say a little bit about that word, and in doing so, again, I'll try to give you a sense of where my use of the word is coming from, part of its sort of genealogical, connection. So the way that I spell this word is displacement, and then there's a space, and then Place, and then there's a slash, and then MEANT. Now, the normal way that this word is offered and given in English is just DISPLACEMENT. Okay. So I want to try to say something about the origins of my abuse of this word. Okay. That comes from two directions. Again, Djaimilia and I were just talking, and as I was preparing for this talk, there was a very particular book by Jacques Derrida that was sort of rolling around in my mind, a relatively later book in the trajectory of his career. The English translation of the book, I won't try to offend you with my non-existent French, but the English translation is Monolingualism of the Other. Okay. Now, the book begins with and is extended as a variation of this very sort of potent phrase that Derrida offers. He continually speaks early on in the book of of the French language as my language, which is not mine. Okay. Derrida is an Algerian Jew who grew up in Algeria, noting and being aware as he began to study in France as a young man, the sonic and phonic deviations that his use of the word French always, a use of the French language always had. The book is in many ways about his accent, about the way in which the French language, which is his native tongue, was always something which, when he uttered it, seemed to indicate his deviant nativity. Right? And this is an experience which many Afro-American people have with regard to the way in which English is used in the United States. Of course, this recognizes that English in the United States is already enacting a pretty profound deviance from English as it is spoken in England. Right? So what's at stake really is a way for us to begin to recognize that it might in fact be the case that our relationship to language, to any language that we speak, but especially and particularly to the language that we are disposed to call our own, is a relationship of estrangement rather than nativity. Right? Derrida, I think, is interested in making an argument for the generality of this estrangement. And in so doing, he's enacting a kind of critical maneuver which harkens back to early 20th century Soviet literary criticism, in which the term estrangement is especially important. It's important here not only because it already enacts or it already indicates this deviant relationship we have to the language which we call our own, but it also is important because it tries to valorize a certain use of language which tends toward the exacerbation of that deviance, right? Not its resolution, not its obscuring, not covering it up, but rather increasing the deviance. And for critics like Victor Shklovsky and Roman Jakobson, you know, who were operating with regard to Russian in the early 20th century, for them, literary innovation required an exacerbation of this estrangement, right? Not a resolution of it, right? So it produces a very different understanding of what would constitute sort of, you know, authentic literary value, right? Where it's not about sort of bringing the language into its own, or, you know, the sort of great but evil American poet T.S. Eliot once used the phrase, purifying the language of the tribe, right? Here in this instance, literary value is understood to be bound up with a kind of depurification. and a deviance, again, a making strange of the language. Okay. So, and one very famous example of this making strange of a language which is mine but not mine is the famous neologism that Derrida coined, différance, right? In which, which is really a word whose deviance is so surreptitious that it can't even really be sounded, right? But it replaces an E in the word différance with an A. And in so doing, it wants to remark and wants to indicate an already given deviance that is internal to any language, right? And an already given estrangement that is internal to anyone's relation to the language, particularly the language that they call their own. Okay. Okay, so that's like the first little movement, okay? And what I just want to indicate is that there is a kind of, let's say, European critical tradition that I want to link my use of this word displacement to. And it would extend from the Russian formalist to French post-structuralism, so that's one place where displacement is coming from. The other place is specifically within the framework and protocols of Afro-diasporic thought. Okay, and there are three figures who I want to mention in particular. Okay, and I'm especially I hope that you are already aware of these figures who I want to mention, but on the other hand, I would be happy to be the person who makes you aware of them, because they're really great and important thinkers and writers. Okay, so the first is a contemporary of mine and an intellectual comrade, I would say, whose name is Nahum Dimitri Chandler. Nahum teaches at the University of California, Irvine. Nahum was born in California, in a small town, a medium-sized city called Bakersfield. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of it. Bakersfield is a really important city in the development of 20th century American culture. And it operates on two levels. There's a very, really interesting early 20th century, mid 20th century novelist in the United States named John Steinbeck. And Steinbeck's most famous book is The Grapes of Wrath. And The Grapes of Wrath is a migrant story. It's a story about strangers. And it's also a story about linguistic estrangement. It tells the tale of a family called the Jode family that moves from Oklahoma to the Central Valley of California, in the southernmost city of the Central Valley of California, which is generally conceived of as what people call the breadbasket of the United States, right? It's a place that is that generates a tremendous amount of agricultural products for the United States. But this family moves from Oklahoma, and it moves as a matter of refuge. They're sharecroppers, which means they work land that they don't own. They're peasants who work land that they don't own as a function of economic disaster, but also climate disaster. They are forced to leave the farms that they had been embedded in that they grew up in from generation to generation, right, for over 100 years, and to shift, and to move as migrants to California. Their status is always challenged. They're of European descent in some biological phenotypical sense, but they are never given the normal status that European descent is supposed to convey in the United States. Okay? They're not just treated as strangers because they come from a different place. Their difference is really coded as a kind of racial difference, and especially as a linguistic and cultural difference. Okay. Insofar as they move to the Central Valley, and insofar as that Central Valley, again, is sort of anchored by this city called Bakersfield in the southern part of California, about 100 miles north of Los Angeles, right? Bakersfield became an extraordinarily important place for the development of American music in the mid-20th century, particularly the kind of music that people call country music, right? Which would be the vernacular music of these migrants who moved from the South to the West. It's probably a weird thing to consider, but I know that this is something that NAM would absolutely consider. I believe that it is, and it's something that should be drawn out in his work. Even though he is a Black scholar and fully embedded in the Afro-American literary and cultural tradition, his work is deeply influenced by the music that emerged from Bakersfield in the 50s, right? I brought my speakers, so I can play you some in a little while if you want. The most important figure, the figure who generally is associated with what came to be called the Bakersfield sound, is a man named Buck Owens. I don't know if you've ever heard Buck Owens. And then a latter day figure in Buck Owens' tradition would be Dwight Yoakam. But the traces of this Bakersfield sound are heard in other parts of this relay from Oklahoma, Arkansas to California. And the key figures there would be like Johnny Cash, like Folsom Prison Blues. Folsom is a town in the Central Valley of South Carolina. And the other would be Merle Haggard. Okay, these are, okay, I can play you some of this stuff. NAM's work is deeply bound up with the question of displacement. The term that he uses is originary displacement. NAM went to the University of Chicago, and when he was there, he actually studied with Derrida. And again, what one can see in NAM's work is like this interesting confluence of a range of migratory traditions, right? A collection of modalities of estrangement, right? Combined to produce this theory that origin itself is displacement, right? And again, it's an extension of a Derridian formulation, okay? So that one way to think about it is that our capacity to express ourselves every moment of our speech, right, tends not to reveal where it is that you come from, but rather it reveals the fact that in a certain sense you come from, okay, so now I'm gonna stop. So imagine that there's a colon after that word from. So I have to stop and pivot just for a second. I hope this comes across, because now what's at stake is moving into deviant forms of the American idiom, okay? So my family is from Arkansas. Nahum Chandler's family is from Oklahoma. My family moved from Arkansas to Las Vegas, Nevada, where I was born, which is about 200 miles east of Bakersfield, right? Nahum's family moves from Oklahoma around the Tulsa area to Bakersfield, California, okay? One of the idioms that his family and certainly my family would have carried across from Arkansas and Oklahoma to California is this idiom, right? Something I grew up hearing my mom and my grandmother say all the time. They would speak whenever a crowd would gather, they would say something like, Well, there are people coming from some of everywhere, right? They came from some of everywhere, okay? What originary displacement indicates is that the condition of coming from some of everywhere is a general condition, okay? That, again, what it indicates is that everything that we would associate with what we might call our nativity or our locality is in fact simply the aggregate of a range of and a history of dispersal, okay? All right. All right. So Nahum's one figure, okay? And again, if you think about Nahum's family or my family, what you recognize is, so Nahum went from Bakersfield to UC Davis, which is again in the northern part of the Central Valley of California, okay? And then from UC Davis, he went to graduate school at the University of Chicago. And then he taught for a little while at Duke University, and then at Johns Hopkins University, and then at Tohoku University in Japan before coming back to UC Irvine, and a lot of other spots in between, okay? Nahum is what one might call an itinerant intellectual, a rogue intellectual, right? And there's something about the work he does that has in fact required this mobility and this movement. Do you understand? And you could say, well, it could all be traced back to his roots in Oklahoma, but his roots aren't really in Oklahoma, are they, right? Black folks who ended up in Oklahoma at the turn of the 20th century came from someplace else in the deep South before that, right? Black folks who lived in the deep South, I mean, Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, they usually were descendants of folks who came from the Tidewater states of Virginia and North Carolina, right? And of course, the people who came from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, they came from various spots on the African continent, right? And of course, wherever they came from on the African continent, there's a history of displacement and mobility within Africa that is there too, right? Again, we come from some of everywhere, okay? And some of everywhere comes with us when we come. So this is an important formulation for Chandler's work. The other figure that I'm thinking of is Amiri Baraka. Amiri Baraka is one of the central figures in American literature in the 20th century. He passed away in 2013, but his work since the late 1950s really set the terms and conditions for the tradition of American experimental poetry, which is one of the few good things that could be said to have come from the United States in the last 100 years, okay? And I want to read a poem now by Amiri Baraka, which will give you a little bit of an indication of another point of origin or another point of displaced origin that this term displacement that I'm using comes from. So, there's probably a whole lot in what I have said that indicates or could be seen as evidence of my jet lag. But the main evidence is actually that I forgot my glasses at the hotel, which is to say, I forgot my other pair of glasses at the hotel. So I think that's one of the main effects of aging, is that you end up accumulating multiple pairs of glasses, none of which actually work, okay? So, Baraka was born in Newark, New Jersey. And one of the things that could be said about Newark, New Jersey is that, well, not just Newark, but New Jersey in general, is that if you took away New Jersey, American poetry would be deeply, deeply, deeply impoverished, which is an interesting thing to consider since the literati of New York City only ever want to insult people who are from New Jersey, which is seen as, you know, the wilds, right? But for instance, Amiri Baraka and Allen Ginsberg went to the same high school, Barringer High School in New Jersey. Between Baraka, Ginsberg, William Carlos Williams, Walt Whitman, like I said, if you took New Jersey out of American poetry, there wouldn't be that much left anymore. It's important that I mentioned that Baraka was born in New Jersey, in Newark, because what I'm going to read is a poem called "Return of the Native" that he wrote in the mid-1960s. He wrote this poem after leaving Greenwich Village in New York and a kind of bohemian lifestyle that he had built there with a number of other musicians and artists that and his household was a kind of epicenter for this bohemian world. A household that he shared with 2 children and with his wife at that time, whose name was Hetty Jones, another really important figure in this movement. So in a way, what this poem is about is Baraka leaving what he had built as a kind of home. Again, it's a story of a kind of train of displacement, right? And even though downtown Newark, New Jersey is only about 10 miles from Greenwich Village, maybe not even that far, it's a very, very different world. And this poem is about the story of when Baraka, after the assassination of Malcolm X, leaves Greenwich Village and moves to Harlem, right? Which is, again, maybe 4 miles, right? But in a different way, thousands of miles and light years distant, okay? It's important that this poem is called Return of the Native because that's a falsehood, right? He wasn't a native of Harlem, he was a native of Newark, okay? But what the question is, what does it mean for Baraka to imagine himself to be a native of Harlem, right? What does the notion of nativity in Harlem mean for Black cultural workers, not only in the United States, all over the United States, but for people all over the world, okay? And again, Harlem is a place for migrants, right? It's a sense in, there's this, and it is also a place of estrangement, okay? The condition of being in Harlem is the condition of a kind of radical sort of exclusion from the rights that are supposed to accrue to nativity, including citizenship in the United States, right? There's a famous essay by Ralph Ellison called "Harlem is Nowhere." Right? This notion again is that Harlem is a very specific locale, right? But it is a locale in which nobody actually has the benefits, right, of a kind of that accrue to locality. Okay. So it's interesting. Can one be a native of Harlem? Right? Is Harlem only ever a scene, right, or a site for the people who come from some of everywhere, right? Okay. And who, because they come from some of everywhere, it might also be said that they come from nowhere, right? And again, another Afro-diasporic, another Afro-American idiom is appropriate here. Okay? When people are poor, when they are working class folks, often folks describe themselves in that condition as having come from nothing, right? Okay. So part of what's at stake is this interesting relay between everywhere and nowhere, right? Coming from somewhere and coming from nowhere. Okay. And what's at stake also is to recognize the intensity of the cultural wealth of those who could be said to have come from nothing, right? What does it mean? How can we speak of all of what it is that is brought by the ones who come from nothing? Okay. Anyway, here's the poem by Baraka, Return of the Native. Harlem is vicious modernism, bang clash, vicious the way it's made. Can you stand such beauty, so violent and transforming? The trees blink naked, being so few. The women stare and are in love with themselves. The sky sits awake over us, screaming at us. No rain, sun, hot cleaning sun drives us under it. The place and placement of black people, their heavy Egypt, weird word, their minds, mine, the black hope mine, in time. We slide along in pain or too happy, so much love for us, all over, so much of what we need. Can you sing yourself, your life, your place on the warm planet Earth and look at the stones, the hearts, the gentle hum of meaning? Each thing, life we have or love is meant for us in a world like this, where we may see ourselves all the time and suffer in joy that our lives are so familiar. He spells that phrase, the place and placement of black people. Placement is spelled P-L-A-C-E space M-E-A-N-T. Okay. The Derridian formulation of difference is very much about meaning. And one way to think about it is that it is the deferral of a univocal meaning. Okay. Displacement indicates that deferral of univocal meaning. It indicates that the semantic content of a poem is something that comes from some of everywhere and comes from nowhere, out of nothing, right? And of course, this is something that Baraka is already indicating roughly contemporarily, right, with Derrida. Derrida's writing about difference in 1965, 66, and then the famous essay, Difference, comes out in 1968, right? Baraka's writing this stuff at the same time, 1965, 1966, right? They're dealing with some of the same issues, and the issues they're dealing with have to do with the specificities of what one might call a kind of inveterate migrancy, right? That's a matter of geopolitical reality, but it's also about an inveterate migrancy, right? A radical displacement that's already given in language all the time. Okay. Now, well, sorry, I had to stop myself because I was going to jump to a conclusion, but I won't. I'll just keep going like this for about 5 minutes more, and then I'll sort of fall into the conclusion. The return of the native who is not a native. Okay. And yet somehow it's still a return. Okay. For those of us who come from some of everywhere, Harlem is one of the places of everywhere that we come from, right? This is the condition that Baraka is speaking, right? And again, everything moves, I think, in the direction towards a generalization of this condition, right? What's interesting is when one has to begin to try to figure out a way to discover how it is that one comes from Harlem, how it is that Harlem is one of the places that you come from, right? I don't know that there is any genuine and authentic cultural condition in the world today that can be said not to have come from, or one might then say come through Harlem, right? Okay. So that this return and this displaced and original nativity, okay, again, it's a general condition. Now the question becomes, what's your ethical response to that general condition? Is it something that you choose to claim, or is it something that you choose to disavow, right? Okay. This is a general problematic of the migrancy, right, of of our contemporary condition in the world. Do you claim it or do you disavow it? Does your disavowal take the form of a radical refusal of hospitality? Right? You understand? Does your disavowal of the nativity that you bear take the form of a radical refusal of hospitality to someone who you mark as an other? Okay. That's the question. Okay. So putting the A in displacement is a move I copy from Baraka, my hero, and it echoes the way that Derrida puts that A in différance, right? And I guess, he's my hero too, right? There's something about the weight of that silent A. It's an interesting thing to try to consider how it is that you can make the silence in that A heard and palpable in the work that one does. Okay. So when I spell placement, PLACE/MEANT, that's an echo of Baraka and Derrida, as well as Nahum Chandler and one other person. As I sort of bring this to a close, this is a person who I think of as the most, well, I'll just be hyperbolic just for the time being and say I think she's the most important poet now writing in English. And her name is NourbeSe Philip. She's written a lot of extraordinary work over the last 50 years, but her most famous bit of work, her most important sort of well-known book is called Zong. Zong is a book that is about a ship that was called the Zong that was meant to carry human cargo, enslaved people from Africa to the Caribbean. In the 1780s, the slave trade was not just about transporting human cargo from one continent to another. Because of the financial complications of doing that, because of the financial risk of doing that, the slave trade was very important in the development and the modernization of the financial system. And it was particularly important in the emergence of a new industry called assurance at that time, but also now referred to as insurance. Okay. Basically a form of securitization, basically a form of gambling, right? The financial risk of taking many people who you had spent money buying and sending them to a new continent across an ocean in which travel was dangerous, ships were not very particularly refined, lots of shipwrecks occurred, navigation had not been perfected, right? It was a risky proposition, the slave trade. Okay. Insurance, the insurance industry comes along in order to try to generalize or outsource that risk. Okay. So the trip that the Zong took was precarious, scary. At a certain point, it occurred to the captain that they were running out of provisions, particularly fresh water. But given that the slaves who were on board were insured, he made a calculation that the best way to maintain the profitability of this venture was to throw the human cargo overboard. Okay. And then to make a claim on the insurance. A court case ensued because the insurers, realizing that he had thrown the people overboard on purpose, decided that they shouldn't have to pay. Eventually the court case was decided and the insurers did have to pay. The only trace we have of the people who were thrown overboard is the ways in which they are mentioned in the legal discourse of the court case. What NourbeSe Philip does, more than 200 years after the adjudication of the case, is to create a poem in which she uses language which is limited to the language of that case, right? It's an extraordinary work of literature. And one way to think about it is, it's an extraordinary ode to displacement, but it is an ode which carries the weight of a continued meditation on displacement that goes back for Philip 40 years, particularly to an essay an essay called, whose part of whose title is Displace. Okay. Now, so here's sort of half lesson number 3 in Afro-diasporic vernacular idiom. Okay. Displace can mean to take something that's in one place and put it in another, where the dis is a kind of a prefix that implies some sort of change or negation. Okay. But dis is also a very specific way that many immigrant folks for whom English is not their native language pronounce the word this. Okay. So, oh, I thought I heard somebody say, okay. I should, well, anyway, okay. So, displace might be a way of saying this place. This is a deictic word. It indicates location, right? This is like a deictic is a pointing word, right? It's a word, right, that really grounds, meaning in the position of the speaker of that word. Okay. So what we have in this relay between this place and this place is some really interesting convergence, right, of shift and ground. Okay. NourbeSe Philip, her family is from Tobago, part of the nation of Trinidad and Tobago in what was a former British colony in the West Indies. Trinidad is very, very close to Venezuela. It's practically South American. Okay. In this essay, Displace, okay, what Philip is also referring to is sometimes she uses the word disspace. She's an avowedly feminist poet. The displace also for her indicates, as she puts it in the essay, this space between my legs, right? Okay. The confluence of a kind of involuntarily publicized private female space. Okay, right? What it is, the condition of Black women whose privacy is constantly under a kind of publicizing duress. Okay. And at the same time, what she wants to indicate is what it means for Black women who have been radically excluded from the public, which at the same time places them under duress, to actually enter into public space. Right? So I hope I said that semi-clearly, right? Public space is denied to Black women. They're not supposed to be on the street. And if they are on the street, their presence on the street makes them subject to the violation of their private space, right? Right. Literally, and this is an English idiom where private space or privates indicates their genitals, right? Okay. So there's this double edge of the notion of displace and disspace that animates NourbeSe Philip's work too. Okay. And that's also something that I've been trying to investigate, because it strikes me that there is a deep an important and irreducible feminist and maternal content that's bound up with what it means to have been displaced, with what it means to have no place, with what it means to be unsettled, with what it means to have been conquered by settlers, right? All of this stuff is extraordinarily important to me in the work that I've been trying to do in the last 10 years. So this term displacement has these multiple origins. What I've been trying to explain is why it is that my spelling of this term is meant to indicate the fact that its meaning comes from some of everywhere. From Derrida, from Russian formalism, from Nahum Chandler, from Amiri Baraka, from NourbeSe Philip. And it comes from all the people who they've been reading. And it comes from all the places that they've been. NourbeSe lives in Toronto now. It's a Toronto word, and a Tobagan word, and a Las Vegan word, and an Oklahoman word, right? Again, it's a word that comes from some of everywhere. And what I'm hoping to do is to mobilize this word, again, in the interest of making an argument for the generality of coming from some of everywhere. Okay. For the general ethical imperative to refuse, right, singular notions of nativity, right, and the modalities of settlement that emerge from those singular notions. So, I don't know if it's possible for any word, even an abused word, even a recombined word, right, to indicate all of the things that it's meant to indicate. I'm not trying to make that argument for my use of displacement, but I hope that what it accomplishes is a way of encouraging the embrace of these forms of linguistic and also geopolitical estrangement rather than their disavowal. So anyway, I've talked long enough, and I'm happy to play Buck Owens for y'all if you want to hear it. And I'm happy to have a chance to answer questions if you have any, and to talk about all of this, especially with Djaimilia. So thank you.
Thank you, Fred. So I don't know if you wanted us to listen to some music now, before the questions, or during the questions, or after the questions.
Well, it might be nice. Sometimes we can. Well, it'd be like the analog to cleansing our palates, you know. So we probably need to
Okay.
to clean out your ears. So I'll play. I'll play one piece. It's actually one of my favorite songs, and I think it's a pretty good example of what people call the Bakersfield sound. So it's by Merle Haggard. Just bear with me just for 1 second. I have to fight my computer to find what I want. Okay. Okay. So. Okay.
more than my old guitar, more than my old guitar. I love my old guitar like God loves the poor, but I love you even more. You know there's love in our family, and not a lot I hate to ignore. And love is for music, and guitars for loving, but I love you even more than my old guitar, baby, more than my old guitar. I love my guitar like God loves the poor, but I love you even more. There'll be no need for saving if you knew what the Lord had in store. What waits forever, the mind can't imagine, but I love you even more than my old guitar, more than my old guitar. I love my old guitar like God loves the poor, but I love you even more.
That's a displacement song.
Thank you. Gostaria de saber se alguém tem alguma pergunta. Vamos dar início às questões. Se alguém gostaria de começar. No. No questions.
Okay.
No, but I have a question. I have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
So, the first one has to do with the first part of your argument when you were explaining the word and the spelling of the word displacement. And I was thinking about the first things you said about locality and about the difficulty of changing from one place to another, from one place to an unfamiliar place. And so I was just thinking, how do we go from the displacement of language to the displacement of the human body? What is the relationship between the two? And this has to do, in fact, with the other question, because I was just, when you were talking about Amiri Baraka's poem, I was thinking at some point, but can one be a native at all? And even though I don't know the answer to that question, I was thinking, can a word be native in some way? Because I was wondering if you weren't pointing to, your argument weren't pointing to something like an inveterate migrancy of language itself. So in a sense, no word can be native, even though words belong to idioms and belong to nations and all that.
Well, I think, so there's two kind of ways I think you could answer that question. One would be to accede to an already given notion of native or of natality, and then in which case the answer would be no, that I don't think that one can be native. Okay, so, which is to say, I don't think a word can be native, but I also don't think that a person could be native. Okay. Then there's another way to answer it, which requires a transformation of, or refusal of, an already given understanding of what native means. Okay. If we decide that what we want to do is transform the meaning of natality, then the way to do that would be to say that natality already bears strangeness, right? Natality isn't the opposite of strangeness. It's a variation on strangeness, right? It's a variation on estrangement. Okay, so one of the really important books that kind of shaped Black studies, particularly in the United States and in the Caribbean over the last 50 years, is a book by a sociologist named Orlando Patterson. And the book is called Slavery and Social Death. Okay. I believe it came out in 1982. So it's a crucial book for anybody who does the kind of work in the university that I do. And one of the things that he does in his analysis of slavery, in the opening chapter of the book, which is called The Constituent Elements of Slavery, is he says that slavery is in part defined by what he calls natal alienation, right? That what it means to be enslaved is to be radically distanced from your natality. That's his formulation. And it means that he's kind of accepting an already given understanding of natality, right? I guess what I'm asking is whether or not it might be possible to imagine that in fact alienation is, as it were, native to natality. Okay? So natality, we think about nativity and we think about it in terms of a relationship to a native land. Okay? But nativity also means birth. Okay? And so what I'm trying to indicate here is what can be derived from imagining that birth is already that it is on its most basic level a form of alienation. Right? It is a form of distancing and estrangement. Like that's what it is. It's what it is to have been delivered, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So we are born into alienation. We are born into this. That's what it is to be born, right? It's a really interesting. In English, to bear is to carry, right? You bear something, you carry something. But it is also to deliver, to give birth, right? There's a double edge in the very word, right? In the word, right? It's got two meanings to it from its inception. To carry, but also to deliver, right? To stop carrying, right? I prefer to think of nativity and natality by way of this doubleness, right? In other words, natality is a word that is a stranger to itself. right? It's different from itself, right? Okay. See, why is this important? Okay. What if it turns out that the brutality with which people tend to treat those who they see as different is best understood as a disavowal of their own internal difference? Okay, right? What does it mean to have to, why is it that people are so invested in the disavowal of their own internal difference? How have our social structures, how have our ideas of personhood and personality been predicated on this notion of individual purity, or what a great teacher of mine named Cedric Robinson calls organistic integrity? Okay. So see, the reason, you can hear it just in the way that Merle Haggard sings, right? You can, I mean, sorry, Jamil, I'm just blathering now, but I'm desperate to make sense. You know what I'm saying? It's like, y'all really listen to music? Like, I want to, now I'm like, I want to hear the imaginary duet that never could possibly have taken place between Merle Haggard and Amalia Rodriguez. Okay? Okay, because Fado and the Bakersfield Sound are two examples of displacement in music. Okay? And it plays itself out, even at the most basic level, it plays itself out in the delivery of a note, right? Like, what great singers learn how to do is to figure out how to accept and manipulate the inevitable decay of the notes that they sing. Right? That's, okay? Which is to say, they're interested in the ways in which the notes are impure from the very beginning. They're interested in the ways that the note is an act of deviance, right? Not of purity, not of, okay, so this is, as far as I can tell, everything that we like to think that we love under the rubric of art is all about how it is that people deal with that deviance, that internal difference of a thing. It's like how to accept it rather than refuse it.
Okay. Why do you think people just tend to reject their internal difference?
Because the notion of the self and of personhood that emerges in the modern age in conjunction with, well, it's based on ownership, and it's based on the notion of a kind of the capacity to acquire completeness, right? The capacity to come into one's own. It's how we understand maturity. It's how we understand normative personhood. Okay? And it's very much, and of course, it's always a losing proposition. And because it's impossible, it generates extraordinary brutality, right? We imagine that completeness is a thing that we can acquire, right? And when we acquire completeness, right, in inverse proportion to the ways in which we disavow incompleteness, okay? And when we disavow incompleteness, we project incompleteness onto others, usually as the mark of racial and sexual difference, and often of class difference too, right? These, and that's this one way to, the general way in which the figure of the migrant is vilified all over the world is that the migrant is understood to be somebody who just simply does not have the capacity to properly come into their own as a person. And it turns out that this tendency towards impurity and incompleteness in the migrant is also understood to be contagious, right? So it's why it is that the rejection of the migrant is understood as a matter of national hygiene. Right?
Yeah. Does anyone... Alguém quer fazer alguma questão?
First of all, thank you so much, Professor Fred Moten, for your beautiful presentation of this argument.
Thank you. It was a stupid talk, and I realize now I'm never doing it again.
Yeah.
The whole purpose of gathering in this way is to deviate from the talk to the Q&A as quickly as possible. So I apologize.
Oh, and thank you also, because I think it's absolutely compelling description of how we can change the way we think of the idea of self, of what an individual is. But I was, as I was listening to you, I was curious to hear what you think about the consequences of your description in what concerns the idea of a nation. What are the consequences of, politically, does that mean that we are not born into nations? Yeah. We are not born into bureaucracies.
Well, my favorite thing in the world is this website in the United States called Etymology Online. So it's like my constant companion. And I wish that I could just have it directly plugged into my brain. So yeah, I would say that we are not born into nativity as it is understood as a kind of univocal thing. We're not born into nations. That nativity, as it is generally understood, and nations, as they are generally understood, are unnatural. And I'm pretty sure that nature, native, and, and nativity are all etymologically connected, which makes me wary of my own formulation, right? Like there's some, right? Like there's probably something problematic about my invocation of nature, right? In my disavowal of nationality and nativity, right? So the better way to put it would be to fall into the delusion of nativity and nationality is one of the things to which we are naturally given. It's just not a good thing. And luckily, our nature also seems to bear the capacity to avoid that if we can, or to think critically about it, right? So no, I don't, I mean, for me, the term displacement is a way to try to make as radical and as severe an argument as I can make against nativity, nation, identity, right? And it's interesting and important that it is the work of the people who have been denied access to nativity, to nationality, to identity. It is their work, it is their cultural work which gives us resources, if we choose to accept these resources, that might allow us to move past those notions. Because if we don't move past them, if we don't get through that, it actually constitutes a clear and fundamental danger to the very capacity of human life to continue to exist on the earth, right? Okay. So that's.
Thank you so much for this mesmerizing moment and your generosity in sharing so much knowledge. I have a very dumb question. You were talking a lot about that impossibility of being native, but in the beginning you spoke and underlined the importance for you of locality. So how can you articulate that impossibility of belonging to a place, of being from a nation, etc., and the needs of being in one place and the locality that you mentioned?
Well, okay, so two things. I'm glad to. So when Djaimilia asked, can a word be native, or can a person be native? And I said, one cannot be native, and I was also trying to make a little implicit argument about one, as in that number, as in the very notion of individuation, which is to say that it's not only that one cannot be native, but that what the impossibility of what nativity implies, right? What a revised conception of nativity implies, right? The revised conception being that it includes, that it is already given as strangeness, right? That nativity is estrangement, okay? That we are born into difference and estrangement. What that implies also, interestingly, is that we are born into, okay, so I have to back up a bit, okay? So what I'm interested in is like this really intense. So what I was trying to say at the beginning was that there are these two impulses which seem fundamental for me now. One is the impulse to an impulse for grounding. Okay, I'm saying it differently than I was going to say an impulse to stay home, and I was going to say an impulse to be grounded, but I'm going to say an impulse for grounding. So there's a great Guyanese historian and political figure named Walter Rodney, who wrote a book called The Groundings with My Brothers. Okay, and for him, grounding means this kind of very specific kind of social activity of study. He taught at the University of West Indies, but he spent a tremendous amount of time in the neighborhood in Kingston, Jamaica called Trenchtown, right? Which Bob Marley makes famous in his music. And he spent time just talking with regular people there at a moment of great political upheaval, and eventually it got him fired from his job at the University of West Indies, right? But so there is this sense, so when I mean grounding, I mean being with the people who you're with in an intense social way, wherever you are, okay? Like, in the United States now, there's an idiom that a lot of political organizers use where they talk about making a space or holding a space, right? And I mean something like that, okay? So, but then I'm also invested in I like to travel, okay? Or another way to put it would be, I like to be someplace else. Okay, so how do we understand, how do we navigate this relay between being where you are, which means being with the people who are where you are, and at the same time this desire to be someplace else? Okay. It turns out that physics over the course of the 20th century has given us ways to think about what appears to be this paradox, the paradox of what one might say of occupying a determinate position, while at the same time seeming to have some kind of impact in a place that is radically distant from the position that one is said to occupy, right? Physics works this out with regard to what it calls particles, right? And the term that physicists sometimes use is entanglement to describe this condition in which it appears to be the case that a particle is somehow both, that a particle is way over here, but having some kind of social, physical impact way, 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 way over there, right? Right? This is, I mean, Einstein called this spooky actions at a distance, okay? The other word that physicists use for it is non-locality. So I guess the best way to answer your question is, I said locality because if I say locality, it feels like people know what I mean. But what I really should have said was non-locality, okay? In this physical sense, right? And what it, okay, so that in my mind, in my computer, right? In the music, in the way that I hear music, for instance, when I listen to the Bakersfield Sound, when I listen to Merle Haggard, I also feel like I'm hearing this like amazing Korean folk singer named Kim Jong-soo, right? And I feel like I kind of can hear La Niña de los Peñas, the great flamenco singer from Andalusia, and Amalia Rodriguez. You understand? Like I hear there's things going on, and I know that they didn't know anything about each other, you know, right? It's something that shows up in the decay of the note, or what Roland Barthes called the grain of the voice, right? There's a commonness, right? In you know, and or in other words, I feel like music gives us the clearest and easiest access we have to this thing called spooky actions at a distance, right? And it is this convergence, you know, of grounding and travel. Or another way you could put it is grounding and flight, right? It's how it is that the unfamiliar becomes familiar, right? Like, I was in Spain last year, and I mean, y'all know more about this, and I don't know, but you know, they can be very, you know, they're very picky about their ham. You know what I mean? You know, right? Like how it should be sliced. You know, and I remember these people were very nice, and they were hosting me, and I was just like devouring all this ham. You know, and it was so good. But the way that the cured ham, you know, in Spain, reminded me of the cured ham that I grew up eating in Arkansas, and we did it in a very different way. Like I feel like I think about these things in relation to music and food, okay? So I believe that there's like a deep structure of peasant food all over the world, and there's some white starchy thing that doesn't really taste like much of anything, but it's very filling, and it's usually, and you can have pretty much easy access to it. And then there's like cheap, gristly meat that you cook for a really, really, really long time until it becomes really, really flavorful. And you mix those things, right? With some sort of vegetable that's essentially a kind of ground provision. And they've got that in Hawaii, and they've got that in what we now call Nigeria. And they've got, right? They got it here in Portugal. I just don't know. I haven't had it yet, but I know they have it. They have it. Do you understand? This is what I'm saying. Okay. So this is these what Chomsky called deep structures with regard to these deep structures are this. That's what I mean when I now would say non-locality, right? It's these flavors emerge from deep and continual social interaction in what we would call a given place. But they also happen all over the world, okay? And usually when this happens, the people who are doing it, okay, are the people who have who have not just been denied normative personhood, they have been, their practices have been seen as the opposite of what normative personhood is supposed to achieve, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Fred. Mais alguma questão? Mais alguma?
Thank you so much, dear Fred, for such a beautiful and generous talk. I think I could talk with you for, but I'll just try to make a concrete question. So thank you, first of all, for bringing, or for reminding us that the self is always in a process of difference, like Derrida told us, or as Silva Winter said, human as an hybrid. But as we see more and more, and also as a legacy of this idea of the modern self that wanted to secure itself, also to secure a place. We see walls being built and borders being closed more and more often. So I would like to ask you if you could help us think about strategies of hospitality that could help us counter, even if it's like everyday strategies, or how do you think, or how do you put those strategies in place in your work? If you'd like to share with us. Thank you.
So, I mean, I feel like the two things that are important to say is that if I tried to pass myself off as someone who had special knowledge about these strategies, then I would also have to admit that I have not been very effective at all in their implementation. You know, but nevertheless, I think there's some things that I know, but if I know them, I only know them because I think we all know them already, right? And it's really just an extension of what I was saying before, right? That these, okay, so there's a great anthropologist in the United States named James Ferguson, and I'm right in the middle of reading this very short little book he's got called, I think it's called something like Sharing and Social Presence. And I think that there's definitely a relay between what he calls sharing and hospitality. And sharing is a great word because it implies it's not just, you know, to share is to render incomplete, right? To break something up into shares or units. But it is also to produce a condition of something that we might call more than completion, right? What sharing does is it makes you, it produces a condition in which somebody who you share with is more than what they were when you share, right? So it's a, you know, and it's another one of those words like displacement and like difference. And I think hospitality is a similar word. Hospitality is a condition that accrues to those who might be said to have a home. And in sharing your home, what you do is literally give your home away, right? It's a displacement of the notion of home. And it turns out that, you know, another word for it that coming from a different kind of tradition of thinking would just be mutual aid, right? Like in a kind of anarchist, it's like Kropotkin or something, you know, right? Like, okay, so my example is something that like I said, it's something that I grew up with. And so I knew it. And I think a lot of people know this. And then the question is, how did I fall myself into a condition in which I don't practice it as much as I should, or very little, right? So sometimes my last 2 years of high school, I lived with my grandmother in this very small town in Arkansas. And everybody had a garden. Everybody grew vegetables. And so I would wake up in the morning sometimes, and I would go out on the back porch, and there would be like a bag of tomatoes. They just were there, you know. Didn't know where they came from, but it was just a bag of tomatoes. And it was like magic, you know. And I didn't and I, you know, be like, Mimi, where did these tomatoes come from? I don't know, you know, but we would eat them, you know. And I finally figured out where they came from when my grandmother said to me one night, go across the street. Her best friend, who was also her greatest enemy, lived across the street, Miss Maddie. They lived there for 70 years, you know. And she would say, go across the street and just leave these peppers on Maddie's porch. Do you understand? Right? Okay, so that, stuff like that, okay. And it turned out that this small town was just like an experiment in mutual aid, like that. Like that's just like how people lived, right? And the more that I think about it, the more that I remember, I think I'm remembering accurately, the more I realize that so much of everyday life were these very intricate, but at the same time casual rituals of this kind of behavior, right? And but you know, I got sent to school, and what I was sent to was a place in which, you know, I was sent to college. I was sent to finish myself. You know what I mean? To become myself, and it strikes me that becoming myself seemed to indicate that I was extracted from those practices. So for me, I think that the question is, how do we revive those practices? I have a great friend named Manolo Callahan. He's a great scholar who's also in that Central Valley of California. The term he uses is renew our habits of assembly, right? So I feel like we have to figure out how to renew our habits of assembly, okay? And that renewal, you know, again, it requires an embrace rather than a disavow of estrangement, of difference, of displacement, of sharing. It requires an embrace of incompleteness, right? Which can be both less than complete, but also more than complete, you know? So, it probably will also require the abolition of lectures. Okay.
Thank you. Myself.
Well, thank you, Fred, for this. And as I was listening to you, I felt like putting this question. And Nuno said he had that dumb question, which wasn't at all. Mine is probably dumb, both dumb and sentimental. Because I was listening to you, and I haven't read your texts and poetry for a few years. I actually did something very cheesy, which was I brought my All That Beauty with me for you to sign up, which is something I never do, but I couldn't resist. But I always felt that your poetical and critical testimonies were very were pessimistic in terms of love, the way you saw love. And my question, but as I was listening to you, there's time has passed. I'm older. You're older as well. So my question is about love, and somehow has to do with the topic of today. How do you see love, and the possibility of loving today? Tough one. Sorry.
Well, I'm sorry if I seem pessimistic about love, because I'm not. So if I seem that way, then I must have been doing something wrong. But what I am is, yeah. No, you don't. There's really no such thing as a dumb question. There's only dumb lectures, right? Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, okay. So, actually, so there's a really great filmmaker who I've known for a long time, named Arthur Jafa, and he made this movie once called "Dreams Are Colder Than Death," and he actually, if you ever see that movie, you can see my grandmother's house in the movie because he filmed down there for a little while, and at one point he films a bunch of people talking about Black life in the United States, on the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington and King's "I Have a Dream" speech. And he asks the people that he interviews if they have one question, right? And so the question that I guess I ask is, can Black people be loved? And it seems like a pessimistic question, but it's really like a trick question, So first of all, it's a quotation. It's Bob Marley and the Wailers' last album called Uprising, there was a song, which is sort of the hit song from the album, called "Could You Be Loved?" Right? So I was echoing that, right? And in the midst of the film, I answered the question. I said, yes, I mean, Black people can be loved, And in fact, I was kind of also echoing the work of some really great scholars and thinkers in contemporary Black studies in the United States who actually are collectively known as proponents of a theory called Afro-pessimism, right? So, and I think Afro-pessimists sort of do ask that question. And I think that Afro-pessimists are more likely to fall on, to be more skeptical about this capacity, right, of Black people to be loved, right? Like one of the key figures is a guy named Frank Wilderson, And at one point in a book of his called Incognito, he calls into question his own capacity just to be with other black people. The black personhood has been so constructed as a kind of absolute negation that how could a black person be an object of love for another black person, right? It's a very shorthand version of the thing. Okay, so I was like, no, so I was thinking about it in a really flat-footed kind of empiricist kind of way, which is like, I'm a black person and I love other black persons. So the answer to the question is yes, but that's 10 years ago, 12 years ago. So I would answer it in a different way now. Okay. First of all, because I would think about love in a hopefully a more refined, but also a more sort of apocalyptic way. Okay. First of all, sort of first formulation would be love is violent. Love is not some sort of dreamy condition in which you meet someone and accept them in their absolute fullness as who they are and somehow constitute for them a kind of nurturing reflection of who they are, right? Like that conception of romantic love. Love isn't a condition in which you either acknowledge and honor someone's completeness, nor is it the condition in which you make someone else incomplete, right? Nor is it the condition in which you complete someone else. I'm hopeful that this really horrible movie called, what's the name of this movie? Sorry, my brain is, it's got Tom Cruise in it, he plays like a sports agent, Jerry Maguire. I was hoping that you had been spared the misfortune of seeing this movie, but American culture is like an octopus, so you probably have had to see it. But if you remember at the end of the movie, it's a classic sort of marriage plot, right? Going back to, the origins of the novel. And it's like, at the end, he sort of has to woo his wife back into the fold of his personhood. And he says, "You complete me," right? That's a statement of extreme brutality, right? If all the person who you love is the 12% that you were missing, right? That's like really a horrible thing to say to somebody, but he uses that formulation as a way of wooing, right? Okay. But love does not make you complete, nor does love honor your already given completeness. My experience of love is that it messes you up, right? Actually, to be, to use very specific, technical, intellectual language, love fucks you up, right? Like you get messed up. You are rendered incomplete, okay? You are not left intact, okay? And often our expressions of love are that. They are, so, which is to say, they are violent, right? There are forms of disruption and imposition. And what I would say is, this is a good thing. But what it also means is that the answer to the question, can black persons be loved, has to be different. And I would say that the answer is no. But the answer is no, not because blackness as a social field is incapable of love, but rather because love is precisely the sort of practice which undermines individual personhood, and like happily so, okay? So I would generalize the formulation and say now, persons can't be loved, okay? Like love is a social practice that disrupts individual personhood, and it's a good thing that it does, right? It's probably the only thing that makes it so that we can still be breathing here on this planet. Okay. And most of the political economic order in which we live is profoundly and brutally anti-love. Okay. Right. Like it's loveless, but it's also just like against love. Right. As Hannah Arendt famously says, in politics, love is a stranger. Right. Okay. So that's an argument against politics, as far as I'm concerned. Right? So.
Mais alguma questão? Não. Não é só.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moten. My question is around how you relate to non-specificity, non-locale, non-definition, more in the context of us making sense around that. So, for example, in these academic environments, because I'm very moved by the way that we've already touched on kind of politics of care and ways of relating to each other, gathering together, like you said, the need to gather. And a lot of kind of vocabulary is very close to somatic, relational, more kind of soft things. And we're still in environments, specifically academic ones, where we must relate to assessments and criteria. But that's why gatherings like this across disciplines are so great. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on kind of further fostering these more flexible, kind of more open, porous ways of, creating new work and creating new knowledge and creating new languages across.
Well, I mean, I feel a little hesitant and maybe kind of disingenuous addressing these questions because I'm older, you know what I mean? Like I'm old in a way. I mean, you know what I mean? Like when I say old, I don't mean to be all maudlin about it, but I mean, I'm about to retire, you know? Like I got like maybe 4 more years. And I find myself these days sometimes, you know, as I'm sure you all know, there are some very brutal and problematic things happening in the university in the United States now, and they've been happening for a long time. I think it would be mistaken to think that that what's going on now that seems so alarming is only a function of political events of the last few months. You know, I'm speaking euphemistically because there's a name that I guess I am supposed to mention, but I refuse to mention that name because just out of sheer, you know, hatred. You know what I mean? I guess I have to mention it. You know who I'm talking about. Okay, but it's a mistake to believe that everything that's wrong right now is only wrong right now. Okay. So the problematic of assessment, of grading, of evaluation that you mentioned in your question, these have been, you know, conditions and protocols which you know, intellectuals in the university have accepted for many, many, many years. And I find myself being excited by the prospect of, I mean, I haven't done grades and assessment in a long time, like probably 10 or 12 years. I just don't do it. I don't even give assignments. I just don't. You know, I figure we have to figure out a way to be together and the class is about the class, when I'm, but even then I'm still teaching, and that's a problem too, like I'm still I'm trying to figure it out. And I guess I'm thinking that maybe the best way for me to figure it out is to get out of the situation that I'm in, like there must be a way to study together that's better than what we've been doing. And for me, the prospect of leaving the university is a happy one, because I think maybe it's out there somewhere and not where I've been working. But again, it makes me feel disingenuous, because I have been working in it, and I've made a living doing it, and I did the best, I tried, and all that. But I'm kind of thinking that, well, what's interesting in the United States now is there's clearly a structural adjustment of the university, okay? And there's a kind of intellectual work that people thought that the university was a kind of haven for, and it is now becoming clear that the university is less and less of a haven for that work. And I think that that's an alarming thing, but it's also a chance, right? So we have to think, okay, well, where are we going to do that kind of work now, since we can't do it in the university anymore? And how can we do it better, since we don't have to do it in the university anymore? So those are the two questions that I'm interested in. So I'm kind of happy to be old enough to be able to ask those questions. And I'm also hopeful that I'm young enough to be able to work on those questions with other people for a long time. So we'll see.
Thank you, Fred. Muito obrigada a todos pela vossa presença. It was a wonderful 2 hours. Now you must be tired. Thank you for your great generosity. I think everyone here feels the same as me. Thank you, deeply.